Welcome to the Salt Lake City Planning Commission. Today's date is Wednesday, July 10th, 2024. The Planning Commission consists of residents from each Salt Lake City district that are appointed in a manner providing balanced geographic, professional, neighborhood, and community interest representation. The Planning Commission reviews and acts on any changes to the city's general plans, small area plans, special studies, zoning ordinances, and zoning district maps. The Commission also reviews and acts on planned unit developments, conditional uses, and certain subdivisions. Our goal is to provide a welcoming and safe environment for everyone. We ask that those in attendance adhere to a few ground rules. 1, silence or turn off your cell phones. 2, respect the person speaking and do not interrupt or do other things that could intimidate or deter others from exercising their right to be heard. Clapping, cheering, jeering, shouting, or other actions used to discourage people who have different opinions from participating will not be tolerated. People who attempt to diminish someone else's input may be removed from the room. If you wish to speak, come to the microphone once the public hearing has been opened and state your name. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to comment. Your time cannot be combined with someone else's time. Everyone will get the same amount of time to speak so that we can ensure everyone is treated equally. If you are a representative of an officially registered, recognized organization and the item you wish to speak on is within the boundaries of your organization, you will be given 5 minutes. If it is outside of your boundaries, you will be given 2 minutes. 4, if you have a handout you want the commission to see, you will need to leave copies because they become part of the legal record. 5, when commenting, speak clearly, keep your comments on topic and brief. 6, questions asked during a public hearing will not be answered during the public hearing. Rather, the commission may ask the applicant or staff to answer questions after the public hearing is closed, or ask city staff to follow up with you at a later time. We will go ahead and get started here with the report of the chair and vice chair. The chair has nothing to report, and the vice chair is on vacation. So we will go on to the report of the director.
All right, thank you. So I was going to give the commission an update on recent city council related items, because there's been a lot of them. Some of them obviously are more high profile than others. But to start, I wanted to remind the commission about a zoning proposal that you saw I think it was about a year and a half ago now, regarding the former Sears location. The council has scheduled a public hearing for that proposal on August 20th, and they have a tentative decision date on September 3rd. So to remind everybody, that's changing the zoning of that property from D2 to D1 and allowing hospitals in that zone. So that's a recent development on a pretty significant project. The council also recently adopted the adaptive reuse incentives. To remind you on those are something you heard earlier this year, but this gives more flexibility on how landmark buildings are used, and more flexibility on sites that contain or within projects that contain a historic building where they're also proposing additional development. So those are two, we think, key things to help us be more creative about how we use or how we preserve our older historic buildings. The other big item, which many of you know, have probably read about, is they had a briefing on the proposed changes to the D4 zoning district that you heard in June. This is part of the proposal to create a sports, entertainment, culture, and convention district. The city council asked us to include, as part of after the briefing, or during the briefing, some proposals to deal with offsetting the impacts of building height through various setbacks and step back provisions. They wanted us to add regulations related to signage, particularly digital signs and clearly define what on premises meant for the overlay. The intent of that is so that if there's a sign at the Delta Center, it can advertise events happening elsewhere within that sign overlay. So at the Salt Palace, the Bravenel Hall, or any other future facilities or uses that might occupy that space. And then they also indicated that they wanted to follow the planning division's recommendation on building heights and design review thresholds. So that would cap the building heights at 600 feet with design review at 75. So that's something that applies D4 wide, so the entire district, not just specifically to those areas. They also asked us to make sure that we're providing adequate training to the Planning Commission. So we will be discussing that with you. And they talked to me after about what they had in mind there. That was really directed at us as staff to make sure that we're giving you the resources you need. They've had a bunch of other briefings. So 2 written briefings that they had yesterday were, so when they schedule something for a written briefing, it means none of the city council members have indicated that there's concerns or issues with the proposal. So they had written briefings on a private application that would allow single family uses in some commercial zones. So you heard that earlier this year as well. And limiting distribution centers on the old landfill site on North Temple. The other briefings that they had were related to text amendments, clarifying when certain form-based standards apply in those districts. There's some vague language that we wanted to make sure we cleaned up so that someone didn't challenge those. Projecting business signs. And then they had a briefing on that proposed street closure that you may recall from a few months ago on 5600 West and 700 South. That's one where Public Utilities Department did not want to vacate. The Planning Commission recommended to vacate it with a pretty flexible easement that made sure Public Utilities had all access rights to maintain the city infrastructure that's there, that they do now. And the City Council did not indicate that they had any real concerns with that. So those will be scheduled for decision. And I think many of you who were here before, we do have a new admin who's going to be helping us, and so hopefully if you weren't here before earlier in the meeting, you met Bonnie Whaley, introduce yourself at the end of the meeting. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. We will move to our open forum. So if any commissioners have anything they would like to bring up, now is the time.
Yes, I was at the city council meeting where a couple of the city council members did raise the issue of more training for us in relation to, it was really kind of directly about our recommendation, in our recommendation to turn down the zoning. It was really about our recommendation concerning a Bravenel Hall. They indicated that we needed training because we really weren't supposed to talk about a Bravenel Hall. However, a quick review of the staff report for that particular evening makes it quite clear that the intention of the mayor in her recommendation about the zoning was that we should talk about a Bravenel Hall. So I would just like to know what the training's going to be about.
Well, I think that's something that we'll discuss, because I think where the council was likely concerned with the recommendation is the portions of it that included how tax dollars may be allocated. I think that's where they were a little bit perturbed. But I think what they specifically asked is making sure we're providing training related to the duties and authority of excuse me, of the I got something stuck in my throat, of the commission. And I think it's, in that same staff report, written by myself, I made a statement that the Planning Commission could make a recommendation about preserving existing buildings and land uses. And so that is certainly within your purview. And that's one of those things that I talked to some of the city council members after about, to make sure that we had some clarity. But it's something that training in general, we all know it's required by state code.
Of course.
And
in state code too.
Yeah, and we provide what we can, but I think we may need to focus on some specifics that isn't available, specific to Utah law, things like that isn't as readily available to the online training resources that we provide that talk about general planning processes, topics, etc. So.
Anything else that we would like to discuss?
Nick, does any of that training have any relevance when something like the Smith Group comes into the town and starts dictating what kind of development will take place?
Well, if it's anything to do with zoning and land use that's under the purview of the Planning Commission, then yeah, we'll talk about what commissioners' roles are and how that interacts with those types of things, especially when it's something where the state law and the legislature creates something unique or different that is outside of our normal processes and procedures. But definitely.
Commissioner Tuttle, just a friendly reminder to please speak directly into your microphone.
If there's nothing else, we will move on to the consent agenda. One clarification, I have not seen any meeting minutes, so
Sorry, we don't have any minutes ready.
we will push that to a later meeting. So we now have two items on the consent agenda. Item number 1 is extension request for design review approval at approximately 410 South, 900 East. Case number PLN PCM 2023-00354. And that item does not have a public hearing. The second item is conditional use for public outdoor storage at approximately 2005 South, 800 East, case number PLN PCM 2024-00332. And that item does have a public hearing. So we will go ahead and open up the public hearing for the conditional use at approximately 2005 South, 800 East. So if there is anyone here who would like to speak on that item, go ahead and approach the microphone. Have we received any emails? We will go ahead and close the public hearing and bring everything back to the commission for a motion on the consent agenda.
I'll do that. I move that we approve the consent agenda items 1 and 2.
A second.
We have a motion to approve the consent agenda from Commissioner Berry and a second from Commissioner Kratzik. Any discussion to the motion? Well, let's take a vote then. Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle,
Sure.
Commissioner Berry,
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
Commissioner Kratzik.
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. The consent agenda passes unanimously. And we don't have any, our one item has been postponed on the regular agenda, so we will go ahead and move to the briefing, which is zoning consolidation project, case number PLN PCM 2024-00707, and our director, Nick Norris, will be presenting to us.
Thank you. So tonight's presentation on the zoning consolidation project is focused on the design standards. So we're going to go over why we have them, what they are, and get some high-level input. Following what we've done with the other briefings that we've done. This is just kind of an overview to prepare the commission for this proposal when it comes in full, because it's a big, massive proposal. I think many of you know why we have design standards, but the three main reasons: to promote walkability, help with placemaking within the city, and implement our general plans that are found often in our community plans, small area plans, etc. The design standards work by defining certain elements that are found within a site or on a building, and what needs to be included. And we'll go over what those mean a little bit as we walk through this. But from one part that makes, I think, design standards somewhat difficult is that they need to be objective in nature, so they can't be subjective. And what we mean by that is that they are somehow measurable, and multiple people, maybe with different perspectives, would interpret them essentially the same way, versus something that is subjective, which could be influenced by your own personal thoughts and things like that. And so that's where this gets kind of fuzzy, and why our standards tend to be fairly rigid in nature. So one of the things that we're doing, which is a different approach than how our design standards currently work, is that in these MU zones, the design standards will be based off of the building type. So that means, here's the building types that we're using. There will be specific standards for a row house that may be different than a commercial building called a storefront or a mixed-use building. And I know many commissioners have brought up certain projects all over the city that are in commercial zones, that are residential, that meet the residential intent or the commercial purpose of design standards, but they demonstrate how inadequate they are for residential uses. And so this is how we're hoping to improve that situation. So the scope of the changes are mostly about clarifying and organizing the standards a little different, so that similar standards are next to each other and follow a logical order. There will be some deletion of duplicative standards and some standards that are zoning district specific when those zones are going to be going away. So we'll update the tables for each district because of that. So we won't change what the standard requires, but you will see when you get this in those tables, some things like in the downtown zones that are proposed to be deleted and some things added. That's really reflective of how we're reorganizing the standards so that they're more logical. We're going to start with probably one of the more complicated design standards we have, which I know everyone, every time that we see certain design review projects in the city, that this is a big thing, is the ground floor use. And so this design standard for commercial uses requires a certain percentage of the ground floor to include commercial uses. On some key streets, it's higher than it is on other streets. Acknowledging if you're on, for example, the State Street corridor, State and Main Street have different standards than Major Street, which runs parallel to those in between them. And then they also include a minimum depth so that we can ensure that there's actually a viable use for there. The purpose of having this standard is to make sure we're achieving our walkability goals in the city, but also providing spaces for particularly small local businesses to locate. For residential, there are some areas where that's allowed on the ground floor, mainly on those secondary streets. And this is particularly important in some of our smaller, the MU2 and MU3 zones, which are scattered and throughout the neighborhoods and often are those community nodes and centers where businesses are. What it can't be, what ground floor use cannot be, is amenity space and other services. We're going to allow lobbies, obviously, but try to limit how much of that ground floor that they would occupy. And then we're deleting this aspect of this that is titled visual interest. This is something that people can do in exchange of having the use. So oftentimes, in many of, you may recall places where people are going to do some sort of a mural on the ground floor instead of having an active use there. And so this proposal actually removes that. We also focus on building entrances. So this is really what the standard tries to do, is ensure that doors are close to the street, that they're spaced to help provide opportunities for customers to enter buildings and spaces. And then that the entry is somehow highlighted by some feature. So these are examples of things that are in the code that help define how you meet that standard. This is another one that we deal with a lot, is this maximum length of blank wall. So currently this standard has a lot of subjective wording in it, so we're deleting those words, and we're clarifying that when you have windows and doors, those actually count. Right now it's a little vague whether they do. And the images here show two pictures of things that we're trying to avoid. That upper left, we don't want big long blank walls along our sidewalks in our walkable areas. And we also don't want a design that technically meets a code, but is really the front of a parking garage. Versus an image from another city on the top right, which has high transparency buildings close to the street, a pattern of windows and things like that, that clearly would meet this standard. When you may recall that when we added standards to the downtown zones, the upper floor step back standard was modified. And now that, even though that's only been in place for a little over a year now, it's become increasingly difficult for many people. And even though we're in a period where we're seeing a decline in applications, a lot of architects and designers are having real issues trying to comply with how it's written. And so this is one where we're simplifying this. This is an image from the actual code with the X on. We're deleting this. It's up there, not necessarily for you to be able to read everything there, but what you can read when you start reading heights like 78 feet and 104 feet, things like that, it really starts to be a cumbersome regulation to comply with. And so we're simplifying this to says, yeah, in buildings over 75 feet in height, there has to be an upper floor step back. It can occur anywhere. Here's what it is. One of the things that we're moving to our code is this angular plane regulation. And so it's going to be moved next to this upper floor step back. So that'll be one of the big things that you would see in that. But we're also adding a kind of a stopping point to where that angular plane no longer needs to apply. So the image on the right, you can see that 45-degree line kind of goes past the portion that it's trying to regulate, and there's no end point. So technically it would apply for whatever distance the building is. And so we're proposing to add a stopping point there. We are adding some new standards. So One is we're requiring public improvements. Ironically, this is something that's not in our zoning code anywhere. It's very vaguely referenced, and so we've been able to tie it to other sections of our code, but we want to be more deliberate about it. So there's a whole list of public improvements. It matches what recently was added to the subdivision code. So this is everything from sidewalks to street trees. And we carried the minimum sidewalk width from the subdivision code into here so that they're tied to basically the intensity of the use. So 4-foot sidewalks are typical what's in our neighborhoods. So that would apply to those low density zones. And then it goes up to 10 feet in zones where the building heights are greater than 50 feet. We do have some zoning districts that require greater than 10 feet. So for example, the D1 zone requires greater sidewalk width. So there's a statement in there that says it's this unless the underlying zoning district includes a different requirement.
So Nick, just real quickly, so 35 feet, I mean, is that the MU4 or MU3?
So MU2 and MU3 would be in that 35 feet.
Okay. Are we going to say it that way instead of 35 feet?
Well, so because this applies to other zoning districts than just those,
I see.
this is how we, instead of listing all those districts. Here's some examples of other public improvement requirements. So adding curb and gutter or updating it to current standards. For the first time, we're actually adding a minimum park strip. This is really important in places where we don't have street trees. Think of the granary where our street coverage or our tree coverage is really, really low, almost non-existent. And we have curbless streets, and every time a new development comes in, they need to add that. So this is now providing that clarity and direction. And then street lighting, and then we also have within our general plans, our community plans, sometimes some other specific public improvements that need to be provided. These are the two zoning districts that both of these are being consolidated into the MU2 zone, but they have some very specific design standards that, for example, in the RB zone, there's certain standards that try to force all buildings to look like a residential building. We're proposing to eliminate that. And then the SNB has some design standards as well that are already going to be covered by the other standards, so we don't need that anymore. I already talked, well, there are some standards that are being moved to other chapters of our code. So for example, here, there's 3 design standards that we have that now either are addressed or we felt more appropriately located in the landscape chapter. And so that's where those are going to be relocated and moved. Now we're going to go through some of the specifics in each of these zones. So these are for the cottage, 2-family, and row house. So these are the smaller residential buildings. They don't have as many design standards as the bigger buildings do and the mixed-use buildings, mainly because they're almost exclusively private types of uses. So building materials, the amount of glass both on the ground floor and the upper floor, the length of blank wall, the screening of all mechanical and service areas, and requiring public improvements. For multifamily buildings, you see those numbers go up. And this is where we start having the ground floor use requirements for commercial uses. And I don't feel like I should read all of these, but we'll pause for a little bit so you can kind of see how they're different. This is not how they look in the code. This is just meant for the presentation. But as you go down to building entrances, blank wall, et cetera, you can see where there's differences in regulations. It's important to note the MU8 and the MU11 are both existing zones. And so these were recently adopted. We might look at modifying some of these, and that's where I think the Planning Commission can give us some direction and guidance on some of these. One of the things that you may recall when we went over the base requirements in the MU2 and MU3 zone is that we have a maximum lot width that we're proposing to add in those zones of 110 feet. And so, for example, this matches that. So in areas in those zones where you can have a zero lot line building, which is possible, you're still maxed out at that.
On the first requirement, you're saying 75% must include dwellings?
This is for multifamily buildings, so there has to be some dwellings on the ground floor at the street face instead of just having amenity space and parking and things like that. As we get to other building types, you'll see that that's different. So,
But, okay, so this is not the MU something, well, it is, because
It
it's
is.
MU2 and MU3 and
Yeah,
MU4 and
but
MU8, so,
this is only for those situations where standalone residential apartment buildings will be. So if you think of some side streets and things like that,
okay, okay.
so that's why it's a little bit different than what we'll see in some of the other buildings types. Here's the rest of the multifamily. So only 2 zones have buildings taller than 75 feet. So those are the only 2 that require that step back. And then these other items are also required. So we have a whole list of public garage standards or parking garage standards. So they have to be screened or wrapped. Parking can't be on the ground floor. They have to have some sort of a use on the ground floor, things like that. So that's what those standards are. It also limits impacts, so lighting, making sure headlights are screened, things like that. With the storefront and mixed-use buildings, so this is where we get it. We still have this is where the ground floor use really focuses on the commercial uses. So within each zone, there are certain streets that require certain uses, commercial uses on the ground floor. So those would apply here. It would also apply if somebody is proposing to build either a straight commercial building or a mixed-use building, if it's not on one of those streets. So that's where these requirements would kick in. So
75% what?
it has to be a commercial use.
Okay, doesn't
Yep.
say that.
Yeah, that's,
Sorry.
Yeah.
just what you know.
so again, we have the certain ground floor of the building materials. This is a standard at 70%. Almost every building is actually meeting this on their own because of the nature of the ground floor. And so, we have one of those questions is, should we just say this is 100% glass, doors, storefronts all count towards this? And so we think that that it can be at 100%. The building entrance spacing, this is carried over and the same as the other uses. One thing I forgot to mention with the straight residential buildings is that some of those, and on some streets, the ground floor residential units have to have a direct entrance or kind of out semi-public or semi-private space outside their ground floor. So it's not just windows there, it's a deck, it's a balcony, it's something like that. And one thing that we have seen is most new residential buildings are doing that. Blank wall again, street facing facade, this is the same, and then these are the same as well. One of the things that we anticipate coming up, although it will be rare, is these building types don't account for certain random uses that are allowed, that are generally public in nature, but sometimes have functions that don't really jive with design standards. And so we have some great examples of these buildings in our city. We also have some great examples of buildings in our city that do comply with all of our standards. And so one of the things that we're
we're debating is, do we want to somehow try to address this or not? This is just a list of some of those. You can see in these buildings, even though that top building is not subject to our zoning because it's state land, you know, a lot of times museums and things don't want to have a ton of windows, things like that, just so they can control the lighting and everything else. Schools oftentimes have certain security requirements that they're trying to build into them where they may not be able to meet the entrance spacing or windows. A lot of these buildings often have large setbacks. Religious buildings, you know, this building actually is a building that's in West Valley City, a place of worship, probably doesn't meet design standards. And also, I don't know how we'd apply our design review standards for exceptions to something like that. And so these are just some of those things that we're trying to bat around and figure out.
You know,
how do
you
we
could
do
have a category of exempt
Yeah.
buildings that are you know, mostly public. I mean, basically listing the uses you've already listed here, that they're exempt, you know, from these standards, but still have to undergo some kind of, maybe not even design review, but something, you know, to make sure that they're still a nice building or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is really, this, you know, you're talking about building a city of background buildings that, you know, it's, and every once in a while you get, you know, an incredible church, or you get a Bravenel Hall, or you get, you know, this building here that we're in. These are not background buildings, and this is sort of a, you know, a very well-known sort of urban principle that there's buildings that sort of build the city, the background of the city, that line the streets, that create the streets, and then there's very special buildings. And maybe not every school is a special building, you know,
Right.
but there must be some way to sort of parse that as exceptional. Maybe, you know, you get the planning commission to decide it's an exceptional building. Let it go, you know, and they apply to be an exceptional building or something.
Yeah, that could be, maybe there's some carve out in the design review chapter to address that. That might be a good way to handle it. Again, here's some more. You know, we're going to eventually, as a city, likely to have to grapple with a change of the Smiths Ballpark, which is one of these buildings that's a good example of that. And, you know, it's existing, so maybe it's different, but, you know, these are the kinds of the issues that where these kinds of buildings don't often fit into that box. So, and then just a reminder of some of our future presentations. So, everybody's favorite topic, July 31st, parking. The parking conversion is actually really challenging. Nothing really goes straight across, and so we have a couple of alternatives that we're going to get in front of you. One of the big things that we're trying to do is, you know, even though a lot of places are eliminating minimum parking requirements, we're not so sure that we have the resources to manage the on-street parking in more places than we currently do if we're going to do that, and that's a big consideration for them. And then in August, we're going to look at the land use tables, and then we're going to bring everything that we haven't looked at, which are, it will sound like a lot, but most of them are reference changes, and so it's not really getting into substantive changes like some of these other things are. And then we're going to start public hearings in September and October. That's all I have.
Nick, I have a couple things that I wrote down. One of my questions is then, are we eliminating how we allow or categorize live-work units?
No, we aren't eliminating that. That still could be an option in some places.
What will that satisfy in this new
So
consolidation?
we're going to have certain streets. So let's take Sugar House, 2100 South and Highland already have in their current zone requirements for certain ground floor uses that do not include some other uses, right? So those kinds of regulations will be kept. So we also, when the MU8 was applied in the ballpark, 1300 South, and I think some of West Temple and some of Main Street had that same provision added, so that we can get those active uses around that track station. In those situations, live work would not qualify. However, if it's off one of those streets or on the side street, it could count.
Could count towards commercial?
Yes.
No, because I think the work units don't work.
Well,
We have them in Sugar House, and not one of them is actually a
But-
work.
but I think the reality is we can't have commercial uses everywhere. There's just not going to be a market
So why
for
aren't we looking at a different approach that then defines those secondary street commercial uses so that those are less? Like, we're not requiring the same kind of commercial uses as
That-
we are on the main
That's
street.
essentially what we're doing.
So okay, it just, I guess my thing is, like, I think live work doesn't get us the results we want. So if the result we want is on those secondary streets to have commercial, then we should be saying it. But if we really don't need it, then why do we have it as a requirement?
So on those secondary streets is where we do have the flexibility for it. It's only in those key areas where the commercial uses are limited. We don't want to necessarily say
Yeah.
on Major Street by the ballpark that it has to be completely lined with commercial uses, because it's just not a reality. But we want to allow that. And then we also, if somebody wants to do a straight residential project on those streets, we want to allow that too, but we want those residential uses on the ground floor to address the street. So they have the entrance, the spaces.
Absolutely.
So that maybe I didn't explain that well, but that's where the direction we're going.
No, absolutely. I just think a live work unit is really a residential unit. And as long as we're treating it the way we want to, implying that they would satisfy some commercial component the way it does now is what's not working,
Okay.
in my mind. And so I also just want to say kudos to the ground floor uses and how we're redefining what we allow. That sounds really, really great. One of my questions on public improvements, because you mentioned, doing certain things that may be required of the general plan, but some of our plans are really old and may not have captured some of the current needs. And so one of the things that comes up in my neighborhood for improvements with larger developments has been like pedestrian mobility and safety. And so we've advocated in the past for a specific development to help with a crosswalk or a cross light in that area, but it may not be captured in every general plan because they're so old. And so are there provisions then to kind of address some of those increased safety concerns for pedestrians when they're adding them to a denser area that may not be spilled out anywhere, but we have the ability to try to address those community needs in an improvement requirement, like in front of the building.
Yeah, so for us to be able to do that, we have to have something in. But the one we do have, in addition, so our general plan includes a number of different types of plans. It includes our community plans. It also includes our pedestrian and bicycle plan.
Oh, I think that those
Which-
are definitely addressed there.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so if they're addressed in those other plans and our
Okay.
our transportation plans, then we can require that.
And then our building entrances, I think, is doing really great. And you're obviously giving us just a snapshot of some of the elements. So I just wanted to make sure, in addition to some of those things you listed out, that we're also talking about lighting, because lighting can be a big part of identifying an entrance, if that's also included in there, which probably is, but it wasn't an example.
Yeah, we can make sure that it is. There's also requirements for like screening of certain lighting, especially like parking lot lighting and things like that, so that it's direct, and also trying to direct it all down
Yeah.
instead of up.
Do we screen lighting? So like the apartment building kind of behind my house has like those open hallways. You go in and those are not screened. Do we have regulations for any of those types types of buildings, which we don't see built a whole lot anymore. But
Yeah,
that lighting goes down because like that one,
We'll look at the wording of the
Yeah.
lighting to
Not
make sure that
I don't
any
know that I have any.
exterior light, because that's technically exterior.
Yeah,
So
it's just part of like their
Yeah.
hallway type thing. And then finally, one of the other things that I wanted to just make sure was addressed was because we do mechanical screening, but are we extending that to like meters that are on the ground? Because I've seen some examples around the city where some of the meters are screened and it's lovely, and then some where they're just out. Are we requiring some sort of screening for that as well? Because those are generally on a street facing. It may not be the major street, but it's a side street.
yeah, we'll look at that, but I think it
Okay.
does require the screening when for all equipment when it's along a street. If it's on the side of
Yeah.
a building, things like your meters are not
Yeah.
necessarily like
Because
gas
we have a
meters.
really
especially.
new build that I go by that has no screening for that. So I just wanted to make sure that was also kind of looked at and addressed.
Okay. I should note that some of those utility companies will not allow them to be screened. They have to have certain
Yeah.
space requirements,
Yeah.
and some in places where we have really small setbacks, that can be really hard. And one of the things that's happening right now, especially with like Rocky Mountain Power, is that they're requiring, if a building needs to have a new transformer, and you see those big green boxes in front of buildings, they're requiring those to be in certain spots now. And so we updated our code a few years ago to accommodate that and address that. But sometimes those are dictated by the utility companies on where they can be.
That's all I had. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
So I want to just kind of get a strong picture of the difference between the way you're defining residential streets or residential uses versus like the commercial. So what I'm understanding is that there are roads that you have decided are the key roads for commercial uses, and then off streets from that, maybe it could be closer to an alley. There are non-commercial areas. Does this kind of codify what we have now into the way that it will be infinitum? Is there any way to flex with when something that is a residential or a residential street has like some growing impulse to become something different? How do we build the flexibility in to have change in our city? And is that possible with the way that this is happening?
It's possible. We would want to take that through its own sort of consideration and process to add something like that. I don't think that we can build in some sort of automatic trigger into our code that if A, B, and C happens, that suddenly these uses are the only allowed uses. I think we'd want to take that through a specific code amendment or map amendment or something to address that. So one of the things, for example, that the city council has asked us to start doing is to look in more areas that can be mixed use in nature. So that, especially along our like arterials and collectors. And so what that means is we're going to be looking at some of those streets that are predominantly residential in nature right now and allowing more commercial uses in those areas. So that's going to be something that kind of gets at that, but it will go through its own process to establish it.
Isn't that about the definition of gentrification, Nick?
I guess it could be
Is that
some.
really a policy we want to encourage?
Well, that's up to the city council to,
Well, then
To
why are we
decide
going
that.
through this silly exercise?
well, if,
I mean, the standards are squishy, they have little meaning. So what's the point?
I'm going to take that as a rhetorical question, but the the reason why we're going through this is that so we can manage the growth of the city,
By we, who are you talking
the
about?
city.
The city.
Yeah.
And I guess the planning division plays some role in that,
That's what we're tasked with doing.
or minimal it is.
Yeah.
So I guess just to my kind of question, if you can just kind of make sure there's some process for more residential streets to become different if they need to be and want to be, and that my hope would be that it wouldn't be so difficult that we are stuck with the exact format of a city that can't change with the needs of a different generation. So I would want a street that is residential to change if needed. So I know that it sounds like that's already going to be kind of happening a lot through a lot of this more mixed use that you're talking about. And so that may already be solved, but just kind of like when an area is not zoned for that, what's the process in 50 years for some change to happen to become commercial if needed?
Yeah, and that's a zoning change process that does that. So there has to be something. We can't write something into our code, like I said, that automatically triggers some change, because any future council could change that through a process, and that's why we have those processes established. So the best way to do that is to identify those areas in our general plan, and then being able to have the resources to analyze and monitor how our plans are working, so that we can come in and make those changes, and we can address, in doing that, some of the impacts that happen with growth and change, like displacement, like gentrification, like these other things, instead of having it just be a straight across type of process.
Okay, thanks for your patience on my
Yeah, of course.
figuring it out.
Thank you.
So how are you going to sort of designate specific streets as specific? Is that going to be like, First South from State Street to 8th East, or how are we going to say this is that kind of
Yeah.
place where you need to be 75 or 70% commercial? Because I wouldn't think there would be that many. It wouldn't be a majority of streets.
There's not. In each of these MU zones, there's a handful.
Right.
But so the way we're doing it right now is actually listing those streets in the coordinates. So
Okay.
if it's Main Street between South Temple and 700 South,
Right,
kind of a thing.
right.
So
And then Main Street outside of that would be like, you could have a lot more flexibility in terms of you could do residential or you could do commercial,
that's right.
right, for that. So, and on some streets, of course, which are not zoned for commercial, you would, or MU, and there are still some zones that are not, that are purely residential, that are still multifamily, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And, an example of where that might change is, say the 400 South, this might be a bad example, but say the 400 South Trax line is extended, or the Trax line is extended through the granary to connect through there. Maybe around those new stations, we have a similar requirement. So that's in a situation where we might add something to our code to require that as our city changes.
Right. Okay. I'm really glad that we're not going to require commercial uses on all of the ground floor spaces of things which are
Yeah.
mixed use, because it really does cause a lot of empty places to be. We're just really overreaching the market there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we do require it in certain streets, then the fact that all those are in one place are concentrated more. The more we concentrate those requirements, I think the better off we'll be, because then the demand will be higher in those specific places, theoretically.
Yeah, and one way that we're doing this in the MU2 and MU3 is by so if there's a property that currently has a commercial use on it, you can redevelop that, provided it maintains some commercial space. So if you have a single story commercial building, maybe there's, an old, I don't know, restaurant in there, it's been vacant for a while, someone comes in and wants to redevelop, and we want to build a 3-story building with ground floor commercial and residential above. Great, this is going to do that. What it's not going to allow is that commercial space to be eliminated completely with straight residential. Some of the MU2 and MU3 zones have properties already that are just straight residential. On those properties, go ahead, make it straight residential.
So existing commercial is destiny on these things? Is that what you're saying?
In those zones, just because
Because it's so rare already.
yeah, and we don't want to eliminate the commercial uses from our neighborhoods.
Right, so the corner stores in
Exactly.
the avenues, for example, or in Sugar House, other neighborhoods where those contribute significantly to the community, and there's good reason to believe that they would be eliminated.
That's right.
Okay. Other neighborhoods too, Rose Park, and so forth.
Yeah, I think especially the Rose Park, Glendale's, Poplar Groves, where they already have a very limited amount of neighborhood commercial, that further degradation or loss of that is going to be detrimental to those neighborhoods. And so that's, we saw that with the proposal of, I think it was called the Glendale Townhomes at the Glendale Shopping Center, where the old grocery store space was replaced with straight residential.
So would this not allow them to do that, or would require them to have a commercial component?
They'd have to have a commercial component.
So, but if they're eliminating a grocery store, let's say the grocery store is, 40,000 square feet, that's a small grocery store, but let's say it's 40,000 square feet, are they going to have to replace it with 40,000 square feet? Or can they just put a little, bodega on the corner? It's like 2,000 square feet.
We'll have to look at that, because I'm not quite sure how specific we are in that regulation.
Yeah.
But it makes sense to have a minimum amount that has to be maintained. I think it would probably be the street frontage at that, whatever the depth is. So,
But that grocery store was, a grocery store. Big. I mean, if you take that as an example and try to solve that problem, maybe that's helps to
yeah.
helps
We'll
to
look
limit,
at that,
to
'cause
limit
that-
your thinking of the way that works, because I can see that can be, they like the grocery store, but if somebody tore it down and built something new, commercial that big, they might not like it. It might not be something that the neighborhood would really want.
Any other questions?
Can you tell me a little bit more about this park strip requirement and the requirement that they would then be able to develop a 12-foot park strip? It was on one of your slides. Yeah, the new standards. So does that be kind of eat some of the wide road and have the developer required to build into that, or is it part of the lot that they're on? Where does that park strip happen?
So it would be within the right of way.
Okay.
So the idea is that it's harder if there's already park strip, right? And they don't need to change anything. This really kicks in when that is non-existent, which mostly is in the Granary area of the city. There's some, I think, in the West Capitol Hill area too that's like that. But in those cases, they'd have to provide at least a minimum. It's possible that the Granary might have very specific regulations that come after this for that. But the idea is to provide more space in our rights of way for particularly street trees and for people. Those two things are the driving force.
Right. Yeah, just trying to see if it was the right of way or the lot.
right of way.
Okay.
Well, if there's no further discussion, we can go ahead and wrap this meeting up. And wow, exactly an hour. And yeah, we will go ahead and adjourn until, well, it's going to be 2 weeks.
Next meeting is on July 31st because
right, 'cause
the
the
24th
24th
would be 2 weeks. So
Yeah.
31st.
Sounds good.
starts of trains and reduce their pollution output considerably. Over the course of the next few years, much progress was made by the city to work with industry to reduce burning, help residents convert their winter heating to natural gas, and reduce pollution from city vehicles. Even the city and county building's boiler underwent a renovation to bring it up to the new standards. The Smoke Control Division did its best to help with the inversion problem until 1944, when its name was changed to the Power and Heating Division, since so much of their work was dedicated to helping residents and industry eliminate burning in their methods of heating. By 1949, city engineers estimated that they had reduced the layer of